Foi ele que inventou a palavra e ficou. Foi mesmo o momento fundador de todo o discurso sobre utopia. O outro ponto de referência é mais recente, é a Revolução Russa, que aconteceu como sabem, em 1917, há 100 anos. Na segunda parte da temporada vai ser 100 anos. Obviamente também foi um momento fundador do discurso sobre a utopia, porque provavelmente foi a primeira vez na história da humanidade que se tentou criar uma utopia a esta escala, uma escala quase continental, tendo em conta a dimensão da União Soviética. Então, com estes dois pontos de referência, vamos fazer uma viagem ao longo do ano, e embora estes pontos de referência se situassem no passado, nós vamos sobretudo olhar para o futuro, vamos sobretudo ver como este conceito hoje em dia já não tem muito a ver com essa ideia de uma sociedade ideal onde toda a gente quer chegar, ou toda a gente tem que chegar, querendo ou não, mas é visto mais como, cada vez mais, como uma reconquista da política, da democracia de base, a ideia de que vale a pena lutar, defender um mundo melhor do que o mundo em que estamos a viver neste momento. É um movimento contra o status quo, um movimento a favor do pensamento e de um ativismo democrático, político, que neste momento está a surgir um bocado em todo o mundo, em muitos movimentos de base, desde os Estados Unidos à Espanha, a árabe, aqui em Portugal também. E nós vamos um bocado acompanhar estes movimentos. Decidimos criar vários temas do tema utopia, quer dizer que agora, em outubro, novembro, vamos sobretudo falar sobre estes movimentos de base. Depois, novembro, dezembro, vamos focar a questão dos refugiados e voltar e utilizar esta questão de facto também para voltarmos a olhar para a ideia de diversidade cultural e de viver em comunidades diversas. Depois, no início já do próximo ano, começámos como era inevitável, com a ideia de comuna, de comunismo e estas utopias que têm a ver com a viver em comunidade. A seguir falámos sobre os afetos e a política e também sobre o capitalismo. Temos alguém que vai nos falar sobre o capitalismo como também uma utopia, que acho que é um ponto de vista bastante interessante. E no fim sobre o futuro verde e sobre a ecologia e sobre a necessidade, de facto, que é uma utopia que neste momento está muito presente, porque estamos a viver num mundo em que, de facto, a questão ecológica é uma questão de sobrevivência para nós todos. Bom, era só para fazer rapidamente esta viagem. São muito bem-vindos hoje, agora, e também em todos os próximos eventos que vão acontecer ao longo do ano. Agora vou passar a palavra à Liliana, que criou este programa em conjunto comigo.
Boa tarde, meu nome é Liliana Coutinho e estou aqui também a trabalhar com o Marco e principalmente também pensar estes ciclos e pensar estes debates que queríamos fazer convosco. Como o Marco referiu, a nossa ideia em abordar a utopia não é propriamente olhar para o passado, para o que foi, nem fazer uma referência ao texto, ou comemorar o texto de Moore, mas pensar no futuro e, pensando no futuro, olhar para o presente e pensar o presente, ou pensar a utopia, não da forma como se calhar ela foi mais pensada, como uma construção que se constrói, que se pensa fora da experiência e um mundo ideal para o qual se deve tender, não é? Nós sabemos que historicamente essa maneira de pensar o fazer a comunidade, a construção de uma boa comunidade resultou muitas vezes no seu contrário. Então, a nossa abordagem sobre a utopia, que de certa forma perspassa todo este ciclo, é pensarmos a utopia como uma ferramenta crítica para olhar o presente. E este é o tom geral um pouco do ciclo, e contamos também hoje com a Merijn Oudenampsen, que trabalha precisamente sobre essa forma de olhar a utopia. A conferência do Merijn chama-se Em Defesa da Utopia, tendo como referência este passado em que as utopias tiveram de ser postas de lado, pela sua experiência concreta, não é? Eu não vou explicar muito mais porque ele está aqui para fazer essa defesa. Queria só, muito rapidamente, apresentar Merijn, que é um sociólogo político, alguém com uma experiência académica, mas também uma experiência de terreno nos movimentos sociais. Neste momento ele está a desenvolver uma investigação no âmbito de um doutoramento que está a terminar, que faz um mapeamento e olha para as práticas e as ideias que estão subjacentes à ascensão de um populismo de direita, que neste momento está a decorrer também na Holanda. Portanto, o foco dele no terreno, de onde vem, conhece de uma forma mais próxima também. E é alguém que também tem organizado simpósios, conferências, é editor, participa regularmente em debates públicos no âmbito da sociologia política e como comentador também. Portanto, hoje queria agradecer também a vossa presença e referir que nós estamos a fazer o web streaming desta conferência com o apoio da Fundação de Computação Científica Nacional, a quem agradecemos também. Merijn terá agora algum tempo para apresentar a sua defesa da utopia. Depois eu vou deixar este espaço, mas voltarei depois para poder também apoiar na mediação da discussão que espero que aconteça a seguir, que será muito bem-vinda. Merijn, I will switch to English. I know that you can understand perhaps a little bit of what I said, but I would like to thank you for having accepted to be here, and I just did a short presentation of what you are doing now, and I will just give you the word to follow, and then I'll be back at the end. Okay, thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me here. It's really nice to be in Portugal. My presentation is called In Defense of Utopia, and I will be talking a lot about the original key text by Thomas More. But first, when we think of utopia nowadays, there's images that haunt us. And some have gone on to trace the totalitarian experience back to a foundational sin, and that sin is Thomas More's Utopia, written by this man. So that will be the topic of my presentation today. This year marks the 500-year anniversary of the publication of Thomas More's Utopia, the book that describes a society on a fictitious island named Utopia became the founding text of the utopian tradition. In the past century especially, More's Utopia has acquired a bad reputation. Cold War critics have described the book as a prefiguration of modern totalitarianism, an example of the dangers of utopian thought. Any attempt to radically think society anew, these critics have told us, will result in violence and dictatorship. Now, at first sight, it is not astonishing that Utopia has been cast with the stain of totalitarianism. On the island described by More, private property had been abolished, and personal liberties were highly restricted. In the intellectual climate of the Cold War, it was seen by both sides as an early precursor to the communist ideal. Marx, Engels, and Kautsky, the founder of the German Social Democrat movement, all considered More to be a communist hero. In the year after the Russian Revolution, Lenin ordered the alteration of a monument to the Tsars, the Romanovs dynasty. It was modified to honor the thinkers who had contributed most to the liberation of mankind. More was among this select group. He belonged, so to say, to the Hall of Fame of communism. As a result, Utopia has been interpreted in two different directions. For the socialists and communists, who took More's Utopia as an inspiration for their movement, it was important to stress the realism of the utopian alternative and to underplay the book's satirical and ironic subtext, to show, in short, that another world was possible. For the other side, the Cold War critics, it was also important to stress a literal interpretation of Thomas More's Utopia. This time, to point towards the totalitarian aspect of the society sketched by More. The famous author Solzhenitsyn, for example, argued that More had already foreseen that communism required forced labor and enslavement. Now that the Soviet Union is gone, it is possible to reconsider More's Utopia in a less loaded context. Of symbolic significance here is that Vladimir Putin recently ordered a monument to the revolutionary thinkers to be destroyed some years ago, and he installed a replica of the original eulogy to the Romanovs. Of course, the significance of More's Utopia stretches far beyond the text itself. It functions as a platform to debate the merits of utopian thought and intellectual engagement as such. Does utopianism necessarily lead to violence and totalitarianism? Do utopian ideas need to end in a miserable fit of the blues? As Marx once famously wrote, is it possible to transform society on the basis of ideas? And what role can intellectuals play in politics? Utopia is a rich, humorous, and complex text, which still has a lot to teach us. After 500 years, it is time to rehabilitate Utopia as one of the key texts of the Renaissance and a much-needed inspiration for the radical democratic imagination. The classic case against utopianism has been made by the liberal philosopher Karl Popper. As explained in his famous The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1945, and more at length in The Poverty of Historicism and Utopia and Violence, Karl Popper sees utopianism as an approach whereby one must first, and here I quote, determine the ultimate political aim or the ideal state before taking any practical action. Only when this ultimate aim is determined, in rough outline at least, only when we are in possession of something like a blueprint of the society at which we aim, only then can we begin to consider the best way and means for its realization and to draw up a plan for political action, unquote. Another defining characteristic of utopianism is its holism. I quote again, the desire to build a world which is not only a little better and more rational than ours, but one which is free from all its ugliness, not a crazy kilt, an old garment badly patched, but an entirely new gown, a really beautiful world. This approach, which was called utopian engineering by Popper, necessarily demands a strong centralized rule of the few and is therefore likely to lead to dictatorship, according to Popper. Since there is no rational or scientific way to determine what the ideal society should look like, differences of opinion on these matters take on the character of religious disputes on which no compromise is possible. Any difference of opinion between utopian engineers must therefore lead, in the absence of rational methods, to the use of power instead of reason, i.e. to violence. As an alternative, Karl Popper proposed piecemeal engineering, small-scale experiments, trial and error. And these were the condition for the development of an open society. Unlike the utopian engineer, the piecemeal engineer does not strive towards the establishment of a future ideal. His or her concerns lie wholly in the present. Karl Popper's critique of utopian thought and his reduction of politics to scientific rationalism in the here and now provided the philosophical basis for the turn towards technocracy of the post-political era after 1989, culminating in Fukuyama's claim of the end of history. The rejection of utopian thought, inspired by Popper, was a key element in the shift of social democracy towards a centrist, technocratic, and pragmatic politics. Traditional socialist ideology was now understood as a utopian desire for a radical transformation of society. Social democracy, we were told, had to become an enemy of utopia to defend the open society against the closed society that utopian thinkers aimed for. In my own country, the post-political era was inaugurated in 1989, when the leader of social democracy, Wim Kok, distanced himself from the striving towards the grand aim in a remarkable similitude to Margaret Thatcher's famous dictum, "There is no alternative, Tina." Kok stated, "We no longer speak of a vision or the alternative of social democracy. There is no alternative for the societal constellation we have now, and therefore it's no use to aim for such a thing." Ironically enough, the closed society, as it was defined by Karl Popper, was based on the notion of an end stage of history. At this point, a harmonious society would await us where all conflict had disappeared. Originally, it referred to Marx's notion of communism, but in fact, it is eerily similar to the end of history thesis as it was developed and popularized by Francis Fukuyama. So the declared redundancy of socialist ideology has ushered in Fukuyama's end of history, which, again, is a closed society. The argument is a discursive Möbius strip. What is more, I believe the argument to be false. Utopianism has not led to the closed society. In fact, there is much to be said for the opposite argument. The open society has been inaugurated by utopian thought. The democratic revolutions in the US, in France, and in the Netherlands were inspired by the republican ideals as articulated in the work of More and Rousseau. Internationally, thinkers such as Frederick Jameson, Terry Eagleton, and Russell Jacoby have proposed a reassessment of utopian thought. While a utopia as a blueprint is generally seen as problematic by these authors, the reappraisal concerns the iconoclastic form of utopian thought that primarily functions as a critique of the status quo instead of a master plan for the future. In the words of Eagleton, bad utopia persuades us to desire the unfeasible and so, like the neurotic, to fall ill of longing, whereas the only authentic image of the future is in the end the failure of the present. On closer examination, Thomas More's Utopia turns out to be much more in keeping with the idea of utopia as critique than the notion of utopia as a closed blueprint. Here it becomes necessary to present some basic information on the book. been talking about it for a long time. But it consists of two parts. In book 1, Moore introduces himself and his friend Peter Giles, who actually existed in history. And he recounts his first acquaintance with the fictitious traveler Raphael Hiflodé in the streets of Antwerp. What follows is a description of the discussions they have on how society should best be governed. And they also discuss whether intellectuals, and in this case humanist scholars, can fruitfully engage with politics as advisors to rulers. At the end of the discussions in book 1, Raphael proposes to tell Moore and his companion Giles of his experiences on the island Utopia. The second part of the book is the detailed exposition of the nature and customs of utopian society, as told by Raphael on a table to Moore and Giles. And naturally, the narrator, Raphael Hiflodé, is a literary device, a fictitious figure employed by Moore to present certain radical ideas without having to take responsibility for these ideas. The island of Utopia that Hiflodé describes in book 2 is in some aspects a very desirable place, certainly compared to 16th century Europe. In Utopia, socio-economic equality is the norm since there is no private property. Nobody goes hungry, and there is no homelessness. Utopians have a 6-hour working day, and everybody gets to do the job they like most. There are limited forms of democracy. If a tyrant takes control of political power, the utopians can dispose of him. There is universal education and healthcare, and there is a policy of religious tolerance. On the other hand, utopian society is highly restrictive of personal freedom. Children can be transferred from one family to another or one location to another to maintain optimum population density. Leisure is strictly regulated, and people are not allowed to amuse themselves in wine bars, alehouses, or brothels. Utopia also features slaves who take care of the dirty jobs no one is willing to do. Free citizens of Utopia can be condemned to slavery if they disobey the rules. What's more, each family is led and controlled by an elderly patriarch, and women are supposed to serve their men. Also, utopians feel entitled to colonize foreign lands that are not cultivated and to violently subdue its indigenous population if necessary. What to make of this? In some aspects, slavery, patriarchy, colonial violence, Utopia is not unlike 16th century Europe. In other aspects, Utopia anticipates some of the accomplishments of modern welfare states. And again, in other aspects, the highly organized and omnipresent nature of the state reminds us of 20th century totalitarian regimes. Here, the much debated question arises whether Moore himself saw Utopia as an ideal society. All in all, Moore's Utopia is a complex text whose meaning is not immediately transparent to the reader. For instance, Moore distances himself at various points in the text from Raphael's description of Utopia. First of all, by using the word Utopia itself. The term is an invention of Thomas More, a combination of the Greek ou and topos, place, meaning no place. It's a play of words upon on the word utopia, derived from the Greek good or well, and topos, which means good place. The pronunciation of the two words is similar, leading to confusion, which was undoubtedly Moore's intention. Secondly, the name Moore has chosen for his narrator is Raphael Hiflodé. The surname is derived from the Greek word hyphlos, used frequently by Plato, and the name translates as peddler of nonsense or idle talk. His Christian name, Raphael, stems from the archangel Raphael, who gives sight to the blind and guides the lost. Thomas More's Utopia, then, is the story of a non-existing place told by a fictional narrator whose unreliability is implied by his name. Nonetheless, Utopia is not merely a refined prank, a private joke shared amongst the 16th century humanist scholars familiar with the Greek language that More used to hide his jokes in. As the name Raphael suggests, the reader is guided somewhere and vision is imparted to the blind. What then is More trying to tell us? The discussions in Book 1 are generally perceived as key to understanding what More sought to achieve with Book 2, Raphael's description of the nature and customs of Utopia. In this discussion, Raphael describes the violence of the enclosures of the commons, the forced privatization of the common farmer's land in the England of that time that Marx would later describe as primitive accumulation, the process in which the great masses are suddenly and violently torn from their means of existence and flung onto the labor market as proletarians. And Raphael describes a discussion with the English archbishop on how to prevent theft and crime. Raphael pleads against ever harsher punishments and proposes to do something about the root causes of crime, eradicate poverty. But nobody is prepared to listen. These discussions have taught Raphael that involvement in politics is of no use. Europeans are resistant to new ideas. Princes are deaf to philosophy and more concerned with making war than hearing ideals for peace. And courts are filled with men who admire only their own ideas and who are envious of others. More concurs, and he answers Raphael, when your listeners are already prepossessed against you and firmly convinced of opposite opinions, how can you win over their minds with such out-of-the-way speeches? Since there is no room for academic philosophy in the councils of kings, More proposes Raphael an alternative approach, and I quote, "There is another philosophy better suited for the role of a citizen that takes its cue, adapts itself to the drama in hand, and acts its part neatly and appropriately. This is the philosophy for you to use. Otherwise, when a comedy of Plautus is being played and the household slaves are cracking trivial jokes together, you come on stage in the garb of a philosopher and repeat Seneca's speech to Nero from the Octavia. Wouldn't it be better to take a silent role than to say something inappropriate and thus turn the play into a tragicomedy? You pervert a play and ruin it when you add irrelevant speeches, even if they are better than the play itself. So go through with the drama as best you can, and don't spoil it all just because you happen to think of a play by someone else that might be more elegant." What does this mean? In the Cambridge translation of More's Utopia, the translators Logan and Adams explain that the comedies of the Roman playwright Plautus involve low intrigue, and the tragedy Octavia, in contrast, is full of high seriousness. And in the speech that More alludes to, the Roman philosopher Seneca lectures Nero on the abuses of power. In other words, if the play of politics is performed as a light comedy, why ruin it by playing one's part as if it were a serious tragedy? Scholars have long been divided on how to interpret this metaphor of the play. A first reading is that More's advice to Raphael is a justification for appeasing rather than confronting power and for working within the system. This is the common theme of the totalitarian interpretation. They applaud More's appeal for patience and gradualism and criticized the hot-headed activism of Ravel, who wants to eradicate evil down to its very roots. More stands for sober reformism. Ravel embodies the revolutionary spirit. Ravel's answer to More is proof that the island Utopia is in fact a realizable blueprint. And Ravel thus becomes the literary variant of a monster of Frankenstein, a construct that, once given life, rebels against its creator More and takes control of utopian discourse, leaving a trace of violent destruction in his wake. But there is an alternate reading, which has been gaining in popularity in the last decades. It interprets the advice of More as a plea for enveloping critique in a literary or artistic form. Drama creates a space and place which looks and feels like reality, where marginal ideas can suddenly become the norm. More's alternative philosophy is an artistic strategy which involves the creation of an imaginary life world that operates according to different axioms, leading the spectator to experience reality in a radically different way. The critic is no longer an outsider trying to convince people that what they hold to be true is actually wrong. The critic turned artist invents a radically new world where the coordinates of right and wrong are rearranged. A world that can be experienced by the audience as a convincing and therefore detailed and holistic reality. Of course, such an approach also implies a limitation. As the work is fictional, it loses part of its authoritative power. It is not to be taken literally. Instead, it opens itself up to the interpretation and imagination of the audience. Important here is what scholars have identified as the serio-comic mode of Utopia. More and his close friend Erasmus, with whom he discussed and conceived Utopia, were both admirers of the Greek-Syrian ironist known as Lucian of Samosata. Lucian's writings took the form of dialogues and short pieces of prose in which he could make serious political points covered in satire. In 1506, a decade before the publication of Utopia, More published a translation of 4 works of Lucian, together with some additional translations by Erasmus. As part of this tradition, Logan and Adams mentioned the Golden Ass of Apuleius, the Praise of Folly by Erasmus, and the later works of Rabelais and Swift. Logan and Adams refer to this tradition as serio ludere, to play seriously. As More wrote in a preface to his translations of Lucian, the quality of this tradition is that it obeys the classical requirement of literature to combine delight with instruction. Not coincidentally, the ironical subtitle of More's Utopia reads as follows: a truly golden handbook, no less beneficial than entertaining. A lot of the fun for the humanist scholars in the circle around More and Erasmus consisted of the fact that some contemporaries were actually duped into believing that Hyphlode and Utopia really existed. For example, in More's first letter to Giles, originally published as the preface of Utopia, he subtly informs his readers that none of the information can be relied upon. More writes to Giles that he is uncertain whether he rightly remembers the length of the bridge over the river Anaider at Amarot. He also forgot to ask Ravel about the coordinates of the island itself, the whereabouts of Utopia, not an unimportant piece of information. He implores Giles, therefore I beg of you, my dear Peter, to get in touch with Hyphlode in person if you can, or by letters if he's gone, and make sure that my work contains nothing false and omits nothing true. Of course, Ravel will never contradict anything that More says, let alone correct his errors, since he's a fictional character. In a second letter published with the next editions of Utopia, More suggests that those that doubt the existence of Utopia should go and speak with Ravel themselves, for he is supposed to be alive somewhere in Portugal. More ends by saying, I only want them to understand I only answer for my own work, not for anyone else's credibility. In a second letter to Giles, he responds to the criticism of a very sharp fellow who has noted some absurdities in the institutions of the utopians, or caught me putting forth some things not sufficiently practical about the constitution of a republic. More's answer is telling. Aren't there any absurdities elsewhere in the world? And did any of all the philosophers who have offered a pattern of society, a ruler or a private household, set everything down so well that nothing ought to be changed? Utopia is not a closed blueprint. It is meant as an open space for imagination and a reflection on possible changes to society. The enigmatic quality of More's Utopia stemmed from the double character of being both serious and satirical at the same time. As the book's title, On the Best State of a Commonwealth and the New Island of Utopia, makes clear, it is inspired on the classical tradition of political writing on the ideal state of the Commonwealth, such as Plato's Republic and Laws, and Aristotle's Politics. Here the conjunction "and" in the title is telling, creating doubt as to whether the island of Utopia can be considered an ideal commonwealth. It is, after all, only a fiction. This much is also confirmed by a poem attached to the early editions, printed in the utopian language and in the voice of the island itself. I alone of all nations without philosophy have portrayed for mortals the philosophical city. Freely I impart my benefits, not unwillingly I accept whatever is better. In conclusion, Utopia does not have nor provide to the reader a wholly satisfactory philosophy. Its system of logic, aesthetics, ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology are constantly undercut and undermined by More. But it's because the reader cannot satisfy themselves within the confines of Utopia that it can become a philosophical city, a place to ponder, and a space within which to think. Seen in this light, utopian thought becomes a force that promotes many of the qualities that Karl Popper attributed to his open society. A spirit of criticism, reason, and reform. Popper argued that the dream of perfection, what he calls aesthetic enthusiasm, becomes valuable only if it's bridled by reason, by a feeling of responsibility, and by a humanitarian urge to help. But what if it's bridled by irony, by metaphor, by the explicit recognition that we're dealing with a fiction here? The problem with many social imaginaries is that they present themselves as a realizable possibilities. Their authors imagine a future or an alternative and present it as the future or the alternative. More's Utopia managed to circumvent that problem by undermining and thus opening up his utopian ideal to the interpretation of his readers. This particular vision of Utopia as an unattainable ideal has been present from the very beginning. It is articulated by Rousseau when he describes his much desired natural state of man as a state that no longer exists, maybe never has existed, and probably never will exist. The present defenders of utopian iconoclasm, such as Frederick Jameson and Terry Eagleton, are in line with More's original spirit when stating that the only authentic image of the future is in the end the failure of the present. Now I have a small epilogue in which I will turn to the more practical political relevance of this rather lengthy literary argument. And I would like to finish with a short reflection on the utopian aspects of the present wave of social movements called by various names such as Occupy, 15M, Indignados, the movements of the squares, etc. There's also a personal story involved. When I was around 20, I was traveling around Europe, protesting against the policies of the IMF, World Bank and the G8 in places like Prague, Brussels and Genoa. Much of the strength and weaknesses of the present movements are, for me at least, reminiscent of the anti-globalization movement then. The explosive emergence and also rapid disappearance of these movements made me think of a comment by the Italian philosopher Paolo Virno, who characterized the anti-globalization movement as a half-functioning voltaic battery, a device that charges and accumulates energy but cannot hold on to it. It discharges everything in one powerful blow. Virno wondered whether we had developed a powerful and refined technological apparatus of which we had just failed to read the instruction manual. The relevance of this view, at least for me, is that we are often prone to underestimate the power of these social movements. Because in comparison to the ambitious goals, direct democracy, and high ideals, participatory decision-making, they almost have to disappoint by definition, much like utopian thought. And this is the Occupy in Amsterdam, Zuccotti Park, Puerta del Sol, the 99%, this was a screening action. This is a protest on the bridge. We are familiar with the shortcomings of these movements. The full-time maintenance of an encampment required an unsustainable amount of energy in the long run. Running the place, which was before a means of protest against the financial crisis and the political response to that crisis, became a goal in itself. The radical openness of the meetings led to political paralyzation. After hours of discussion on the placement of a chemical toilet, there's little energy left to speak of the global financial system. The lack of consensus on concrete demands made it impossible for the movement to formulate realistic short-term goals. The result was mobilization that had to end in disappointment almost by definition. But let's also consider the power of these movements. The American media theorist Mackenzie Wark wrote of the strange, abstract character of Occupy. Because of the digitalization of trade on financial markets, Wall Street had become an abstraction, a series of ones and zeros that circulate between global computer networks. How to demonstrate against digital flows of capital? The answer, according to Mackenzie Wark, is by opposing it with an abstraction of one's own, the encampment with its General Assembly in Zuccotti Park. Of course, the encampment had a material presence, but its symbolic quality was also important, perhaps much more important. For David Graeber, the anthropologist and activist connected with Occupy, the radical inclusivity of the encampment was a form of what he called prefigurative politics, a representation in miniature of the democratized society that the movement strives for. The radical openness of the encampments was perhaps unpractical, but at the same time its sharpest critique of the lack of democracy in institutional politics. It gave everyone that participated in Occupy an idea what it would be to really have a voice. It served to strengthen the idea of voicelessness in existing politics. Some have wondered how a movement that rejects representational politics and champions direct democracy can claim to speak for the 99% of the people who are generally not present. Ironically enough, it is the radical openness and the rejection of representation that makes it possible for the movement to claim to represent the 99%. Much like More's other philosophy, the point is to create an alternative world that operates according to different rules. The problem of Graeber's notion of prefigurative politics is that it's only productive when the symbolism is not taken too literally, just like More's Utopia. A theatrical staging of direct democracy as a form of systemic critique can be very powerful. But when the means of protest become the goal in itself, a real attempt to create the miniature of a direct democratic society, things turn badly wrong. From personal experience, I can confess that after 3 hours of discussing on meeting procedures and the disposal of waste, my enthusiasm concerning democratization has substantially faded. In fact, the outsourcing of decision-making to a political elite suddenly becomes an appealing perspective. The same goes for the appeal to consensus decision-making that seems to have become an intrinsic part of these movements. It only has a democratic potential as a small-scale imaginative critique against the current political system. In other words, as a form of dissensus. If we take consensual decision-making serious as a societal solution, it reverts to a very undemocratic and dystopian character. Who wants to live in a society where everybody has to continuously agree with one another? You get a utopian society in the format of a fishbowl. The tragic ending of the encampment in Amsterdam, at least, made me think of Lars von Trier's film Dogville. A fruitful radical politics then, and here I'll close, is based on a continued dialectic between utopian and immanent forms of politics. When one of these poles disappears, the end of politics is nigh. And I will finalize by quoting the Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano. Utopia is on the horizon. When I walk 2 steps, it takes 2 steps back. I walk another 10 steps, it recedes 10 steps further. As much as I may walk, I will never reach it. So what is utopia for? The point is this, to keep on walking. Thank you.
Thank you, Merijn. It's this epilogue that you did. It was really a way of doing what you announced. That was to use Moore's text as a critical lens for what's happening in the present or most immediate past. So it was like speaking about and also doing. Thank you. I also found very interesting these resonances that arrived through your talk on theater, philosophy, and politics. Not everything being the same, but these productive resonances that I think that they were made very clear. I don't know if you want to comment on these, or if I can perhaps open right away the discussion also to the
yeah, I think I've talked a lot already, so
yes.
maybe...
And it's good also to start quickly. Just say something in Português, that is, se alguém tiver alguma dificuldade em colocar a questão em inglês, pode-me transmitir a questão e eu posso ajudar a fazer a tradução. So the discussion is open now, both for this space and also for the virtual space, because we are doing streaming, and the public that is seeing us through streaming can also address questions. So there's one there. I'll ask you to use the microphone, please.
Yes. My name is Lucy, I'm from Brazil, and thank you for your talk. I'm very much impressed because I'm a teacher in an institution here in Portugal, in Lisbon, and I teach in the doctoral course on design. And the last period, a semester, the first class I have given to my students, the topic was Utopia. Yes, maybe the students are a little bit surprised because in a class about culture and practice in design, the topic is utopia, and the first text was the book Utopia, and so I related this subject to design, and also I mentioned an author that I'm very deeply interested. You have not mentioned him, is Ernest Bloch. And do you know him, his work about utopia? Because for him, I have read he has 3 books translated in Portuguese, published in Brazil. And the title is, in Portuguese, is Princípio Esperança, Hope as a Principle. And he states that utopia is not the ideal, but the idea. And since you have an idea, an intention, you are on the way to achieve some goal. As the process is utopia, not something that doesn't exist, a dream, an ideal, but a process of achievement. What do you think about this idea of Ernest Bloch?
Well, from what I know his work only superficially, but I can... the problem is that there is lots of different definitions of utopia. So what I've tried to do here is to look really at the beginning of the utopian tradition. And what you see here is what utopia is a way to describe the ideal society, but through fiction, through imagination, through metaphor, through theater. So that makes the utopian text utopian and different from philosophy. So for me, that is the starting point of my analysis. And I think that Bloch or Karl Mannheim, who is another of the great German thinkers on this, or Hungarian actually, on this topic, their conception of utopia is very fruitful for thinking about politics more generally. But I think the artistic aspects of the utopia are for me really interesting, especially when we were discussing with people that are working in theater. So I don't get that from Bloch, who's a more kind of more German general structure system builder.
One more. Other person. Here. Aqui. Thank you for your presentation. I am, in a way, simplifying a bit, but if I understood correctly, one of the points you made when you made the link between this utopic way of thinking and some movements that are taking place today in our modern societies, I understood that they are kind of one of the parts of a bilateral equation, and the balance is there. So they are kind of pushing what we would call, or what we would see in the other side as a traditional representative way of doing politics. So how, in your view, would the utopian way of thinking, of approaching, help us in striking this good balance between more democratic participation and a more representative side? of conducting society? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. On a practical note, I think that Spain right now is a very interesting example of exactly this process taking place. And what I hear from Spanish friends, this is actually a very conflictual process in which the movements, the Indignados or the 15M, part of that movement at least, is integrating with a very, well, it's not an old-fashioned political party, but Podemos is sort of based on more classical, also Latin American ideas of political organization. So you see there that clash happening between horizontal, assembly-based organization and more top-down representative politics. And I'm curious whether that holds. What I think the contribution of utopian or let's say more radical movements is that they take a step back and they can view the kind of the bigger picture. So if you have a politics which is only in the here and now, if we're talking about this scientific rationalism of Karl Popper, then you cannot really think about changing things on the long term because you're so busy with trying to figure things out in your next campaign or the next government coalition that you're entering. You lose the big picture of things, and you feel uncomfortable about demanding big radical things because those are deemed to be non-realistic. So I think that's the big contribution of utopian movements, is that they put the non-realistic forward and they claim like, look, this is what we should make into something that can be realized, even if it's only a very faint outline, or is it a theatrical representation of something like direct democracy. And if you lack that kind of critical utopian spirit, you become very soon a kind of technocratic fossil that much of these movements are now protesting against in Western Europe, but around the world.
It's like a movement between present and future.
Yeah, and also inside and outside. I think when I was this very young and innocent 20-year-old boy demonstrating, we had this model of being 1 foot inside and 1 foot outside of the established organizations. And this has since been for me a very fruitful way to think about politics. So there is these two aspects of kind of emancipatory politics. The one is the march through the institutions. And the problem is if you pursue that completely, of course, after a certain point you will become isolated and you will become a cynic and you will play the power games. But you will have influence. And the other aspect, the other pole of emancipatory politics is to create your own little commune, to create your own society or your own little experiment or your own, let's say, women's only place or your own gay bar. But the problem, if you withdraw too much in these kind of alternative realities, you will lose the possibility to affect more large-scale changes. So for me, you always have to combine these two poles, and that creates tension and friction, and that's very necessary.
You always need to keep the senses.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Can you explain a little what do you mean about the artistic dimension of utopian from your point of view?
So, to try to make it very clear, so you have Plato's laws and Aristotle's politics, and they are just philosophical arguments about what should be the ideal state. And the single most important contribution of More is not that he describes, he doesn't make a philosophical argument for a certain society. He describes that society and pretends as if it really exists. So that's a literary strategy. It's an artistic strategy that he's using, and he makes it very explicit that he thinks of it in terms of a play. His own book is a play. More's Utopia is a play that's enacted for us by Raphael Hythloday. So in that sense, it's an artistic strategy. And if you look at the critics of utopian thought, Karl Popper, and his work on the open society, his critique of utopianism, he talks about aesthetic enthusiasm. So he believes that the principal fault of people like Plato, Hegel, and Marx is they created this aesthetic ideal of a perfect society. And if you start from that, it will always end in totalitarianism. This was Popper's argument. So what I've tried to show is that what More does actually undercuts or destroys that argument, because he shows, like, I create my artistic representation of a perfect society, or supposedly perfect society, but I undermine that with bizarre jokes. The people in Utopia, they, for example, they pee in golden piss pots. There's also all these kind of absurdities that he's entered to make the reader go like, oh, what's going on here? Why is he saying these bizarre things? So what More does is that he shows that you can create this image of an alternate reality, and at the same time you can keep your readers critical, or your viewers or the audience, and you can make them think about what the ideal society should be. And I think that is his artistic strategy.
I think that's another question. Then after. So it can be.
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the role of technology in Utopia. I think it was Lenin, I don't like to quote dead people, but I think it was Lenin that said, communism is nothing but electricity and the Soviets. So there was the political side, but there was this almost phantasmatic idea of electricity as possibly bringing this wealth and abundance. And there's always, we don't know if we'll reach utopia, but we know technology is always there and changing. And even in things like the World Wide Web, there is this tremendous utopian connection where people think, okay, we are all equal now, we are close to everyone, we are talking to many different people, different opinions, different colors, but we have to pay €400 for a smartphone. But everybody's buying it, and it's part of this idea that something else is possible. So can you tell us a little bit more about how technology interacts with utopia?
Well, you have to realize that it was written 500 years ago, so there was no internet. I think that the single most important aspect, or technocratic aspect, is the universal education that you have in Utopia, and especially the importance of Greek philosophy and literature. So apparently there was a shipwreck of some kind of boat coming from Greece, and from that the Utopians gathered all the knowledge from ancient Greece, and that I don't think there is, there is the utopian tradition. Technology is very important, and it's more like with Bacon that it becomes really important. And I think it has a double side. On the one hand, there's the belief of the ability to be able to control the environment completely. This you also have in Moore's Utopia, but it becomes more pronounced in Bacon, in the New Atlantis. And on the other side, of course, there's also a utopian tradition that tries to escape from technology, and especially from our modern society, and go back to a kind of primitive commune and be in touch with your spiritual self. So these two sides of utopia are always coming back, and to be honest, I don't think that there is a kind of a single line connecting utopianism with technology, but the importance is the centrality of the blueprint. So if there is a kind of a central blueprint made up by some kind of engineer, as Popper calls it, the utopian engineer, then you get into a very undemocratic situation, and that's usually where technology comes in. And in the 60s you've had architects that have created systems, cybernetic systems, which are centrally controlled, which regulate all our needs and desires. And that is, of course, now, knowing Facebook and Google, we are getting very close to that particular dystopia, actually.
Perhaps before the next question, I may add something that perhaps unveil a little bit. That I think that in the archipelago capital will go back to this question also, because now there are also lots of discussions on how technology can help to create more, namely the social networks, more cooperative community. This is also something to be discussed with a critical lens.
Hello. Thanks for your talk, and I have several questions for you. The first of them, it's actually not a question, but you ended your talk speaking about the maintaining an interplay between, from what I remember, dialectics and immanent aspects of politics. Can you please delve a little bit more on that topic? And the first question would be if your reading of Moore's Utopia has anything to do with the dialectic utopianism of Harvey. And the last question is precisely about this notion of dialectics in Utopia. How do you think it is possible to entertain this discussion while we are also discussing questions of planetary boundaries and limits and limited resources? So how do we maintain a conversation between emancipation and limitation? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. To start with, I pleaded for a kind of a dialectic between kind of the more immanent and transcendent aspects of politics, utopian aspects, and which I mean to say that you always need to have a kind of a more practical, hands-on orientation, and at the same time you will need to be able to divest yourself from those immediate concerns and to look at the horizon and to be able to set a goal for the future, or to be able to critique an entire system. And I think this is the point where we are at right now, is that there is a conception of how the economy works and how politics works, which is solved by the European Troika or ordained by the European Troika. And thinking is actually within that realm of possibility. So to step outside of that immediate realm of possibility and to think how you could replace an entire paradigm that requires, let's say, a more utopian notion of politics. I'm familiar with Harvey's work, but not so much with his notions of utopia. So I'm gonna let you down on that one. About planetary boundaries, I'm very much sort of with Naomi Klein's idea, who is actually using the present ecological crisis, let's say, to plead for radical reform. You know, so there is a necessity of radical reform, unless, you know, and if it doesn't take place, then we are in serious trouble. So I don't think that the present planetary conditions are sort of a bulwark or an obstacle to utopian thinking. I think they largely promote it. So we can now think boldly of how you would kind of reorganize society. And I think the problem is that very few people are doing that at the moment.
I don't want to take too much space. So it was more about can we think about utopia without thinking about telos? So without the notion of progress, without an emancipatory horizon. Is it theoretically possible, or should we probably think of other terms to, I don't know, to organize, to collectively, well, to compose our common world or something?
Yeah, well, I've heard that there is a different conception of society or progress that is shared by indigenous people in Latin America, and they think in terms of balance rather than progress. But for me, it's, you know, you can make progress mean very different things. So I think, for example, it would be progress if we would radically reduce the hours that people work and that you get to spend more free time to take care of your friends, to love your lovers, and to do what you are good at creatively. So that would, in terms of the economy, that would mean that the economy would actually shrink. Also, like if we, you know, there is a tendency to marketize every aspect of unpaid, to try to marketize also unpaid labor. And actually, if you decommodify important parts of our work, then in common sense terms we'd be going backward because the economy would shrink, you know. So if you're looking at the limits of the planet, I think there's lots of ways we can make progress which wouldn't be recognized as progress. And one of the most absurd things is that now there are lots of countries in Western Europe which are generally already overpopulated. They consider it to be a lack of progress because there's not enough babies being born to maintain present rates of growth. So if there's not that much babies being born, it's not that you lack quality of life. It's just that as the economy as a whole will not grow because there is no demographic growth. So like you have to change the parameters of what is considered to be progress.
Well, thank you very much. My question is just, if the search for utopia is also the search for happiness, for a happy society, but if everybody has different needs, wishes, desires, then everybody has a different utopia. So if it would actually be possible, wouldn't utopia always be dystopic? Dystopic.
Yeah, I think utopia can never be realized. So when utopia gets realized, it becomes immediately a dystopia. So the key is to always maintain this tension between the ideal state, which is projected, which is theatrically imagined, but never realized. And it can never be reached. And I think this is also the great tragedy of the communist ideal, is not that it has been reached. So if you look at really existing socialism, it was a transition phase to communism, and communism never arrived. And there was this kind of cruel joke that the line of transition between socialism and communism was running just next to the Red Square in Moscow, where the elite would be next to the Kremlin, where the elite would be hanging out. So I think that's the key lesson to take away from More as well, that you shouldn't present utopia as something that is realizable.
First of all, thank you for your talk. Well, I must have like a million questions in my head, but let me sum all to one or two. So, to put it in very practical terms, if we are to think about a new kind of society, we have to organize politics and economics. The problem today, I think, is that economics with globalization can have a tremendous power, and a power that surpasses the power that the nation states once had. So what this means is that it's very difficult to restrain economic power right now, or to fit in a kind of framework that is able to somehow let it not destroy the planet, as we are now watching. But at the same time, we need to. But at the same time, with the current political tools, we are and we are all aware that we are totally unable to do that. So my question is, how do you read something like what Zizek says, that on the one hand, we clearly need today and in the following years somehow some kind of global regulatory system in order to let the planet to be able to survive and provide us with food and shelter and for the next generations, and as well as to somehow control like scientific and technological activity. But on the other hand, how can we do this? How can we do this without falling into the trap that communism and other utopias in the 20th century has fallen? So I would like to argue about that. I'm not asking for like the ultimate solution for that, of course. But what do you think about it? How can we find some balance between these two dimensions? Is it direct democracy the answer? Is it what people have in Switzerland, for instance, when they can vote in lots of different things? Of course, that's a good thing. But when they vote, for instance, for restricting the building, like how do you call it? Mosques, yes, that was when people vote by like restricting mosques, isn't that a bit xenophobic? So, of course, direct democracy has already imbued in it all these contradictions. So, I would like to hear something.
Yes. Wow. Yeah, I think that the problem with direct democracy, for me, is not so much that it leads to adverse effects. I mean, people have good and bad sides, and the bad sides will always come up, and also in a direct democracy. So I don't think you can sort of prevent that by organizing society in an undemocratic way, because then you will have the bad side also coming up in an undemocratic way, and that's even worse than it coming up in a democratic way. So I think the more practical problem of direct democracy is that once you start operating on a bigger scale, as Rousseau already prefigured, it becomes highly impractical. And I don't think one necessarily needs world government to fight climate change. What one needs is an elite that is willing to do something about it. So we have elites that are mostly interested in working out new trade agreements like TTIP or CETA, and massive amounts of time and energy spent on that. And when it comes to climate change or generally the problems of our planet, somehow the priorities are much less high, and I think there is the biggest problem. And I think that problem is not on the international level, because what you see, for example, with the European Union is when you go to Brussels, business is much better organized than, let's say, the European demos, if it exists. We are divided by language. Also, there is no real public opinion on the European level. So you have a very, very strong group of business interests that is a powerful lobby running Brussels, basically. So I think the same applies for the global level, is that it's very difficult to have an effective counterbalance to global power. It's much easier on a national, or at least a level where everybody speaks the same language. So I would be much more interested on starting on a kind of local or national scale and kind of trying to effect change and then slowly work up to the global level, than installing some world government with enlightened technocrats that are gonna fix the world.
Thank you to both of you, and to you too. My question is about, do you think if now we are more or less utopic than we was before, for example in the Moorish century, that the paradigm is much more based on religious stuff and in God and in eternal salvation, then now there is more materialistic and subject-object relationship with reality? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I actually think that we have often a secularized form of religious politics. So there is a continuation of religion by other means. The ideal society is, of course, a projection of like heaven, but then on earth. So in that sense, I believe that people are still motivated by these kind of ulterior concerns. It is, and in fact, I think materialism is actually, it appeals to these ideas. It appeals to kind of, materialism doesn't sell itself through products. It sells itself through ideals. You become another person. You transform yourself. You get to live another life by buying this perfume or by smoking that cigarette. So I think there is not a break, but a continuation by other means. And this, for utopian movements, I think it's not so much whether they are religious or non-religious, but it's how pessimistic or optimistic we are as a society. The generation of my parents were not religious, but they were all believing in the advent of a new society in a kind of semi-religious way. And now nobody seems to believe in some other society that is coming forth. Everybody is very cynical and pessimistic, and it's much more about damage control. So that I think, can also express itself religiously, so I don't think that is the divide.
There is another question.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed that a lot. Two questions that pick up on things that you've already been asked about. The first is in relation to that question of progress and a kind of utopian movement towards something, and relates to Occupy. I'm interested. Occupy sort of famously refused to issue any demands, and I'm just interested what you think of that, and personally, and where you would look for demands. And what looks promising as a set of demands at this point in time, a set of kind of progressive utopian demands. And famously, everything that's listed in the back of the Communist Manifesto as the set of demands for communism has largely now been achieved under capitalism. But if you like, that might be a product of the movement towards a sense of an ideal. So a failure to articulate demands might be seen as a failure at sort of intermediate level of making a utopia real in terms of demand. The second question relates to what was just asked, which is about cultural production, contemporary cultural production. Muir's Utopia is 500 years old, and a lot of literature discusses how contemporary moods are much more dystopian. It's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism. The picture behind you is a great example of perhaps of kind of contemporary imaginaries. So which would come first, the set of internal complex relations between cultural production and social imaginaries and the political demands? But is a kind of a more optimistic cultural production a necessary precondition for a more hopeful politics, or would it follow on from a more hopeful politics? What's the nature of that relationship?
Okay, thanks. Those are really great questions. So what I've tried to articulate is how I think the not issuing demands by Occupy is a strategy that allows you to represent the 99%, because the 99% doesn't have any articulated demands, but they have very different aspirations. So at the moment that you begin to articulate a very clear program, you can no longer claim to represent that entire group, and you will become kind of something much more specific, and you will adopt the logic of representative politics. So I think in the case of Occupy, it was on a practical level at the same time deeply unhelpful, and its most important strength, strangely enough. And what you see now is a very similar tendency as with the Indignados, that the campaign of Bernie Sanders has taken on a lot of the energy and a lot of the fury against the financial system that Occupy articulated in the beginning. And these demands are much more modest than, of course, what the demands that Occupy would have made. I've seen very ingenious proposals to socialize the banking system. And I think that's a really interesting idea, or to create a new kind of global currency mechanism as it was once proposed by Keynes. Those kind of radical thinking, I think, is still very necessary. Also to push campaigns like that of Bernie Sanders or Podemos in Spain towards a different, more radical, long-term plan. Then about cultural production and the causal link or the causal chain between kind of dystopia and utopian thinking. We've seen a lot of disaster movies in the last, let's say, 10, 20 years. I think I haven't seen any utopian movies really. I think the problem with utopian movies is also that they're extremely boring. Like everything is going well, there's no great conflicts or problems that need to be overcome. Your life is not in danger. You have no existential crisis or fights with your loved ones. So I think that's a big problem of the utopian genre for making movies. It becomes much more. It's more akin to the world of advertisement than to the kind of blockbuster movie. So I would look at it much more on that level. But I think that there are heartwarming movies being produced, but we live in a very skeptical time, and I don't think that. I think that conditions, and I would be a bit Marxist there, that material conditions are actually primary, and then Hollywood is secondary.
Não sei se haverá mais alguma questão.
Alô? Eu vou fazer a pergunta em português, eu vou me sentir mais confortável. Quando a gente pensa que a utopia é jovens, inocentes, são os mais utópicos e os menos escutados, como a gente pode conseguir, então, que a nossa geração aqui, que estamos aqui, que não somos todos jovens, como que a gente pode abrir espaço para escutarmos mais os jovens na sua inocência utópica, para poder abrir, realmente discutir a ideia e assim poder implementar, porque a gente vê, nós fomos jovens inocentes utópicos que crescemos, fomos podados nas nossas ideologias jovens e guardamos isso conosco até o momento onde a gente pode expressar e fazer alguma coisa com isso. Como que a gente poderia nessa sociedade liberar a palavra para o jovem e assim já colocar em prática, sem ter que esperar tanto tempo, né? Sem ser tão cortado, tão podado, e colocar a discussão em dia, né?
I'll try to translate, if not everything, but then you can tell me if there is something that is being missed. The question has to do with how is it possible, what can we do to deliver the word and the agency capacity to the youngers and to she spoke about the innocent youngs and the youth, and she also spoke about this process of trim, this process of somehow trim and blocking and not allowing perhaps the child, the youngest, to be active and to bring with their visions that can be utopian visions also. So I don't know if it was clear.
The last part of trimming the young?
Yes.
Trimming for me is like cutting someone's hair.
No, in fact she was mentioning a process of, I think that it has, the way that I listen, it has to do also with the processes of education and the way that we deliver the agency to children and to young people, that somehow there is a kind of societal process that limits this possibility of acting politically. So she's speaking about how can we open this space to listening to these youngest words.
Well, there.
Because you talk about when you are young and innocent, and
make a demonstration on the street and you say you are innocent. Yes, but everyone is innocent. You need this to go far on the imagination. So, but when you are young, you are all the time cooped, and you are young. This is a kind of young. So how we can do how do something to open this innocently idea to the discussion, something like that.
Yeah, I think this is the principal problem, is that when you're young, you're still unattached, and you don't have any kind of position of power in society, which makes you also more kind of optimistic and naive at the same time. And you have great aspirations for the world, but you have no power to realize them. And once you work your way up on the food chain, you will slowly acquire the means to effectuate change. But in the process, you have probably become cynical, or you have become involved in the power games, in which saying certain things places you outside of the community of realistic people. And that's why I was sort of talking about this 1 foot in, 1 foot out strategy, is that you, to keep some degree of sanity, it's always important to step out of kind of institutional forms of being, and to be in a space where you can be young, even if you're old. And of course, the education system used to be such a space. It was actually thought up in the period after the Second World War, at least in the Netherlands and in Germany and in the UK, that the education system was a kind of a place to create a kind of radical, or at least a counterweight to the political system. So if you would have gone through the university, your role as a critical citizen would be to prevent a kind of new fascism to arise. This was the concern after the Second World War, and it led to a very critical space in academia to open up. And what we've seen, I think, in the last decades is this entire idea that our education system is there to install democratic values, or kind of a critical spirit, or an alternative way of thinking, that this has gradually disappeared in favor of a more directly competitive idea of, where am I going to get my job, and do I have all the proficiencies I need to have? And somehow we need to find a way to return to that kind of youthful spirit of criticism. And I think that there's movements around the world that are trying to do that. Don't know if that's any answer to your question.
Duas questões. Depois ela.
Thank you. In fact, you have mentioned one important point at the end of your speech about the 2-step front and 2-step back. And at the end, the idea is to keep working. In fact, my first question would be if you don't take those 2 steps in front, because I'm going to take you to Africa this time, because I'm from a continent, a divided continent who was living as one block, have been divided. And today the challenge of the African youth is to see Africa together, all of us like the same people. No Cape-Verdean and no Ivorians. So this is a kind of utopia the African youths are living at this time. And for that, we know, of course, that we need to fight against neo-colonization and the control Europe have in Africa, and etc. And my question means, are we keeping working just to produce, to have a descendant? Like, I cannot stop here, I have to be moving till I make a kid and I die, and you keep moving on the same road? Or is that, if those dreams the ignorant youth have are not true, it means what we're learning every day, do you think that it is a lie? Everything we're getting into we're keeping into our brain, that the information we're seeing, the fight and the movement you stand for, if they will not have a change in 10 years or in 100 years, it's gonna still be the same. And for the people like the Africans, who is totally out of democratic philosophy, because we have our culture, our background, like people believing in gods, in stuffs before, and we cannot get the democracy we try to learn. And we can also not get back to the cultural roots we have, because all the world is against it today. So as a utopian thinker, how do you think that this kind of, what is for you the future of the youth African who is dreaming one day to be free from the rest of the world, the politician and animalistic behavior? Thanks.
Okay, this is a bit of a strange position for me as a white European male to plan out the future of Africa. And I think the Pan-African idea, of course, yes, is a utopian ideal, but it was also a very distinct political practice. There were different types of organizations and actual states. Gaddafi actually was a big promoter of the notion of African unity. So it was very much part of the kind of anti-colonial independence movements of the 60s and 70s. And I think the problem is that now power is much more fragmented. And also Western intervention in Africa is much less visible, even though it's there. Or let's say the massive amounts of land that are now being bought up by corporations or by China. This is a kind of a thing we read about in the newspapers only now and then. But it's a kind of an anonymous power that is doing that. There's no clear face to it. There is no clear army that you can fight. So I think that a lot of these problems have to do with the internal divisions within African countries themselves and the power of African elites in selling off part of their infrastructure, their land, their commodities to those abroad. And I think one of the big interesting projects that have been formulated is the proposals to get rid of the African debt, which has been used typically to discipline countries into doing exactly that, selling off their means of production. Sorry, their so let's say primary grondstof. Sorry, I'm just resources. Sorry, yeah. So yeah, I wouldn't be able to advise an entire continent, but again, I would start from the level where you're at and build upwards from there and connect with kind of more global movements that are advocating for abolishing the debt. I don't know if that's pretty utopian.
mais uma questão e depois acho que teremos tempo para mais uma.
I just wanted to ask you two questions. One is going back to Podemos. When you mention it, did you mention it? Do you identify it with? Do you identify its action as a one step in, one step out action? This is one question. The other one is in Greece, the case of Tsipras and his party. Is this the case of two steps in, or and its failure? Thank you.
Yeah, to answer your first question, I mean, that is also because I identify mostly with the people that were in the 15M movement, and I know some of these people personally, and they communicate their kind of frustrations in dealing with the infrastructure of Podemos. So yes, I think being in Podemos would be like being one step in Podemos and accepting all the problems which also logically follow from a party that's being created and exists only 1 year, so there's bound to be massive amounts of difficulties when you just start building such a structure. With Syriza, I think, yeah, for me it's been a really tragic experience, and the central lesson to be learned, according to Lapavitsas, the other kind of central figure next to Varoufakis, is that one needs to have to step out present. You know, you'll need to have a credible threat that you're actually leaving the Eurozone if you are credibly going to negotiate or renegotiate the terms. But I do think I've seen that Tsipras is now traveling Europe to forge an anti-austerity alliance, I have no idea how realistic that is, but that would be, I think, the only opportunity, and I think in that sense it was definitely too early. So what we are now seeing that this basically the entire economic logic that's underpinning the European Union is rapidly losing credibility. And when Varoufakis and Greece, when they when Syriza came to power, it was mostly an educative experience in the sense that it showed how undemocratic the European Union really is. But it's been an educative experience to the detriment of Greece. So that is a very sad reality, I would say, for me and for the Greeks.
Hi, hello. Picking up on that, reading about the first text that was written about the European Union, don't you think, and looking back to the 5 last years, or 6 or 7, don't you think that the European Union as a project can be a utopian project that is becoming slowly and slowly into a dystopian reality?
I think that actually there's been critiques of the European Union using the tools of Karl Popper and basically saying like that the people that created the European Union were utopian engineers and not piecemeal engineers, because they envisaged a whole new infrastructure instead of merely experimenting with some aspects of reality. So in that sense you could say that the European Union is a utopian ideal, but I think there is a need to really separate the European Union from the euro and the kind of the monetary aspect. So that's the weird kind of thing we are seeing, is that the failure of the European Monetary Union is actually driving the kind of consolidation and expansion of the authority of the European Union. And without it, people like Thatcher, who was a kind of an important, say, co-founder of the European Union, they were very, very concerned at the time that the European Union could become a European welfare state. And that's why the British, they really pushed for an extension of the membership of the European Union to lots of different countries, so that the European utopia would never be reached, because with such a diversity of countries you can never achieve the European welfare state. So in that sense, it's not such a utopia. It's much more the utopia divert that we know from communism. We're stuck in the really existing European Union, which is never going to be what the original founders thought that it would be.
Becoming a bit more hopeful.
Yeah, it's becoming
a democratic system, I think.
Yes, and I think this is not going to be sustainable. I don't think that the euro. There's lots of people arguing that the euro is not going to be maintained as it is, because the whole idea of the project was to bring European economies together, and the notion was that we would all become more similar. And what the euro is actually doing is it's making us more unequal. So something has got to give. It cannot continue like this. And so I think there will be some kind of split or some kind of dismantling of the euro at some point.
If you agree and with this idea of dismantling, in order to build again. And it's curious because it makes me think that the next installation that we'll have, it's precisely about this, that will be this weekend, and after that, in a very practical way, it will invite you to dismantle and to recreate again, that it will be this Kate McIntosh project. So there is always this resonance between what we are speaking here and then what we are doing also in terms of artistic proposals. It's like a kind of somehow good way also of ending, because it will move to the next step of the discussion and of the experience. I will switch now to Portuguese. Eu queria vos agradecer a presença e a participação tão interessante. Acho que houve questões mesmo muito ricas. Gostava também de chamar a atenção não só para com certeza que já terão o programa, não só para estes dois momentos do trabalho da Kate McIntosh, um destinado a crianças e jovens agora durante o fim de semana e outro para adultos durante a próxima semana. Será não uma dimensão discursiva como esta que estivemos aqui a ter, mas uma dimensão mais experiencial desta questão do desmanchar e voltar a montar. Depois podem ver aqui o programa. Várias questões que foram abordadas aqui vão voltar ao longo de todo o ciclo. E nestes próximos 2 meses, as próximas conversas terão muito a ver com a questão de como é que movimentos cívicos e como é que uma democracia de proximidade pode ganhar escala. A primeira seguinte será no dia 4 de outubro e teremos Nursel Kilik e Eda Tuzkon, que são representantes do movimento feminino curdo e virão falar sobre o projeto de confederalismo democrático. Depois, em outubro, teremos um outro debate a partir de uma peça que foi coproduzida pelo Teatro Maria Matos, sobre arte e participação, onde iremos pensar sobre essas questões da participação em arte, mas claro, com uma forte componente também social e política. Teremos também a presença cá de Xavier Toré e Amador Fernández Sabater, que irão falar a partir da experiência de Espanha, pessoas que participaram em todos estes movimentos como os Universidades, M15, e que estão a pensar, lhes pedimos para pensarem connosco como é que destes movimentos se criam estruturas políticas com uma outra escala e que inclusive podem ser alternativas a estruturas como o Podemos, não é? E a um certo teatro político ao qual nós também já estamos habituados. Que outras formas de fazer política é que podem emergir daí? Quem estiver interessado, haverá um encontro mais pequeno sobre inscrição com o Xavier Toré. Ele é alguém que acredita muito nas ferramentas tecnológicas para para a participação política, portanto, as informações são todas no programa. Quem ainda não o fez pode também levar este livrinho que está lá fora, com textos sobre todos estes temas, a maioria deles de participantes nestas discussões. Portanto, convido-vos a voltar e agradeço também ao Merijn. Thank you again, Merijn, for this very interesting also discussion that was allowed with the people presented here. So, thank you very much for sim, e queria também dizer o primeiro texto deste livro deste livrinho é do Merijn e intitula-se O Significado de Ser Realista. Realismo é aquilo que muitas vezes se usa para contar. Isso é utópico, nós temos de ser realistas e aqui é um desafio também pensar isso de uma outra forma. Bom jantar e muito obrigada. Espero que
já te apresentaste. Olha, deixa-me pôr isto para